G'day everyone and welcome to Lecture 7 for BMA 703 Entrepreneurship. What we're going to do today is look at the concept of business planning and its relationship to the entrepreneurship process. Now often when we hear stories about entrepreneurs, we tend to think about entrepreneurs as being freewheeling, people who fly by the seat of their pants and don't engage in a lot of strategic planning. The reality is actually quite different, and in fact planning is very important in entrepreneurial ventures, just as is important in normal and ongoing business ventures. Now this topic's important not just because you need to have a good understanding of the planning process, but because the topic of business models, which is linked to planning, is going to be part of the final exam. And I have a question at the end of this lecture that you need to go off and do some self-directed research on. It is actually going to form part of the final exam. And so it's good for you to sort of have a look at this topic and think a little bit about what role it might play. So let's talk about the concept of business planning and strategy, because the two concepts are very closely linked and intertwined. And when we think about planning, we know that planning is actually a critically important activity in all business types. Okay, so it doesn't matter if you're a new entrepreneurial venture, if you're a small to medium-sized business that's looking to grow, or if you're a large-scale existing organisation that's looking to take the next step and diversify into new industries. All types of businesses need to engage in the strategic planning process. And so it's really important that we have a good grasp on what planning actually does. Now, for many of you who are doing things like the MBA or the Master of Entrepreneurship and Innovation, you'll end up actually doing units around strategic planning, and so you'll get a bit more of a detail in those particular units. But what we're going to do here is just give you a bit of an overview about the planning process and what's important. And again, if we look at the research does tend to show us that planning in some form, and we'll talk about there being lots of different forms later, but planning in some form is actually critical to the success and viability of businesses. So planning is really critically important to organisations for a number of key reasons. Firstly, planning helps us to coordinate effort. By sitting down and thinking about what it is we're trying to achieve as the organisation, we're able to work out a plan of how the different parts of the organisation might link together to help us achieve some particular strategic outcome. Again, the analogy here to a sporting or a military context is relevant. A coach or a general would look at how they need to marshal all of their forces in an integrated and coordinated way to either win the game or to win the battle. So planning is really critical for that coordination. Planning is also good for reducing uncertainty. When we engage in a planning process, a large part of what we do is look at the operating environment in which we're competing and make a detailed assessment about what we think the major threats or issues are going to be from that environment. And so the whole planning process gives us a little bit more certainty about what we're likely to do in the future in relation to the context that we currently see. We know that planning also helps to reduce overlapping and wasteful activities. So many things in organisations overlap with each other, and look, to a degree, some element of overlap is a positive. But what we do find is that if there's too much overlap, if there's too much of different parts of the organisation bashing into each other, then a lot of effort of the organisation is wasted, and those resources could have been more effectively used elsewhere. If you think of the concept of lean and lean manufacturing, and certainly the ideas around lean startup, what we see is that by simplifying those processes, we're able to achieve much better outcomes for organisations. And planning is really important for establishing goals and standards of performance. So what we do in the planning process is we work out where we want to be in the future, what are our goals and objectives, and then we develop a set of plans on how we're going to achieve those. And then at the end of the process, the controls kick in. So controls are all about assessing our performance and seeing how successful we've been at achieving those objectives, and trying to determine ways in which we could realign activity so that we better meet those objectives into the future. And planning also aids the process of resource allocation. And what we know is that resource constraints are a major issue facing all businesses, and in particular, entrepreneurial businesses. So strategic plans are a particular type of planning, and we're really interested in these strategic plans here. And these are plans that relate to the entire organisation and our overall strategies for growth and development as an organisation. And so as an entrepreneur, you need to think very carefully about how you develop a strategic plan for where you'd like to be. And certainly the concepts of strategy and planning are very closely linked. There's been a lot written about strategy and strategic planning and the role that it plays in organisations. And again, as I mentioned earlier, there's certainly a lot of evidence to suggest that good, effective planning really does produce more sustainable outcomes for the business. And there is a tension, though, that exists within the strategy and planning literature, and this is the tension between whether strategy and planning needs to be a deliberate and purposeful activity of the organisation, so should it be something that we purposefully set out to do, or does our strategy and planning actually emerge from our activities over a period of time? Pardon me. And there's a classic paper which I've put onto Milo for you by two authors called Mintzberg and Waters from 1985, who looked at this tension and talk about the notion that strategy might actually be an emerging concept, that strategy actually emerges from our actions. But what we do know is that not planning is actually planning to fail. The evidence is pretty clear that planning is a very effective tool for improving the viability of organisations. Now that of course doesn't mean that just because you've got a plan you'll be successful, but certainly planning does tend to help. And there's also a lot of questions asked about whether planning should be formalised or should it be more flexible and organic, a little bit like the tension that we saw around whether it's deliberate or emergent. And some people have actually raised some criticisms of the whole idea of planning. They've said that planning can actually create rigidity, and there certainly is an element of truth in that. So what tends to happen is when an organisation develops a plan, they actually become fixated on that plan, and they don't think about what's going on around them. So everything becomes about achieving that activity. And they're not responsive and adaptive to changes that might happen in the operating context around them. Now look, there are ways you can get around that by engaging in scenario planning, and I think that certainly solid scenario planning is a good way for an organisation to be a little bit more flexible. Some would say that plans are not a replacement for intuition and creativity, that in business, and particularly you see this in the entrepreneurship literature, that gut feel and intuition are much better guides of action than formal plans. Now, again, I'm not sure that I'm convinced about that. I think that if you think back to the article that we read about risk-taking, again, people tend to say that entrepreneurs are high risk takers. I think, no, what entrepreneurs are is people who are good at doing creativity and actually building creativity into their plans for the future. And one of the big problems we see when we think about planning and strategy is that it does tend to focus our attention on what's happening today in terms of our current customers, our markets, our competitors, and not really focusing on what we need to do for tomorrow's survival. Now again, I think there's an element of truth of this, but again, if you've got a very effective planning process in place, then you can actually come up with plans that do take account of what might happen in different possible futures. And really when we're developing a strategic plan, and this is again true for entrepreneurs, the key thing we're trying to do is to create and leverage, or to use, our competitive advantage. So all of our activities are really designed to try and create and develop and to use the advantage of an organisation. And when we talk about competitive advantage, and people use this term a lot, what we're really talking about is the aggregation of factors that set a small business apart from its competitors and represent our unique position in the market relative to those competitors. So any organisation is trying to find some form of advantage, and that advantage enables us to create more value for the customers and to distinguish ourselves and to see ourselves as being different in the marketplace. So if companies look at, if people look at companies like Apple, for example, Apple has some distinctiveness around its design and features that mean it attracts customers to the organisation. Now there's many different ways that we can go about seeking and gaining advantage. We might gain advantage through the products we sell, and so we might try and come up with a product that creates new and different value for the customer. We might gain advantage from the services we provide, so by trying to ensure people that they the products they're receiving are serviced effectively and that they actually deliver on the promise. We might find advantage through our pricing strategies. So again, companies like Jetstar, for example, have used their low cost and low pricing strategies as a way of seeking advantage in the market. Or we might find advantage through our business model, and our business model might be centred around the way or the process we actually go about selling our product to the consumer. And so really what we're doing as an organisation is trying to identify what our core competencies are, what are we unique in doing, and using these unique capabilities to develop a strategy that will enable us to gain advantage over other companies in the market. And this figure here just summarises for us this whole focus of strategic planning is really about building capabilities, developing skills, learning from the environment around us, and rolling all of that up into developing a set of core competencies. So core competencies are really the strengths of the organisation that will lead us to create some sort of sustainable competitive advantage. Now, it's debatable these days how sustainable advantage is. You might only get advantage over the competition for 1 or 2 years, and so as a result you need to be continually delivering on this sort of this process of developing new core competencies and trying to improve what the organisation does. And that sustainable competitive advantage helps us to create and deliver superior competitive advantage for our customers. So that's a bit of an overview about what strategic planning is. What I'm going to do next is talk about the strategic management process and just give you a bit of an overview about some of the steps involved in that process.